This episode, we're going to look at the kick, drums, percussion. Part 2, it's going to be all about the bass. And part 3 is going to be how to recreate that big 2000s style melody. Let's get cracking. The project tempo is set to 170 BPM, and for the first part of this episode, I'm going to be looking through the out of the box sample pack because that's got a bonus UK classic happy hardcore section with lots of different sounds, including kicks, which is where I'm going to start now. There's one really important characteristic that the kind of classic UK hardcore kick has versus the more modern kick, and that is the kind of punchy mid-range. So I'm going to flick through some of these kicks. These kicks are all representative of different eras of the kind of classic UK hardcore sound. This is kind of like the Clubland era one. Classic 909. I'm going to pick 2 kicks out. I'm going to go for kick 1 and I go for kick 2. So you can see from the look of these kicks here, they're very fat and chunky. It's probably the best way to explain it. Versus some of the kicks, some of the more modern kicks in the other part of the pack, which are a bit more pokey and bouncy, and it's really telling from the waveforms. You can see here on the modern kick, it's got a very, very defined attack and then tail, which gives it this kind of bouncy, pokey feel to it, whereas you've got the kind of classic sounding kick there's no real definition there between the attack and the tail. It is all about that mid-range. And again, with this kick as well, you can hear the same versus the modern kick. So when you're making the classic UK hardcore sound, I think if you really want to grab the essence of that era, then grabbing a kick which has got that kind of really like thuddy mid-range is really, really important. I'm going to use both of these kicks. I'm not sure which one to kind of land on yet, but we'll have both in the project. And I think once we add the bass in the next episode, we can kind of pick which one of these is the best to go with. 2 things I'd like to do with the kick. Firstly is I'm going to shorten it so it's only half a beat long, just like this. I'm going to do the same to this kick as well. And that's just because the bass is going to hit here. So it keeps it out of the way of that. I'm also going to move the kick down so it's -8 dB as well. So it's a little quieter. That gives us slight headroom in the mix for later on. Okay, I've duplicated the kick across 1 bar. Now I'm going to add some percussion in and start building the track up. When I build my percussion up, the first thing I like to do is add the percussion which goes on the kick. So there's 2 elements which I would generally put on a kick, and that would be the ride cymbal and a closed hat. So I'm going to start with the ride. This here is very much that kind of like 909 ride sound, which I like a lot. I like that longer ride as well. I think that gives it a more like classic UK hardcore feel. I'm going to shorten that because I don't really want that to bleed into the next one. And I'm also going to turn it down as it's going to play quite loud. If you're familiar with the intros to some of the old UK hardcore stuff, that's already going to resonate with you because you'll hear that kind of ride cymbal on the kick, that longer ride, is exactly what some of that classic UK hardcore had in the intros. I'm also now going to add in a closed hat as well. I kind of like that one. 10's got this like thickness to the attack. I think that's going to complement the attack of the kick. So I've got that -11.7 there. Let's hear how that sounds. So I take out the ride, take out the hat. It's already sounding pretty slamming. The next couple of sounds I'm going to add on are going to be to give the track a little bit of pace and energy. So something like an open hat is great because it sits on the offbeat, which is adjacent to the kick. So I'm going to show you how that works. Oh, that's a good one. It's got like that kind of weightiness to it. So the sound that I'm going for is something like this, which is like a much heavier kind of open hat as opposed to something like that there, which is a little shorter. It feels a little bit flimsy, that one. It's not something I would go for on the off, whereas this one here, it's got a real kind of like grit to it. So you can either have a longer open hat like this here, or you can have it much shorter, Depends on the kind of groove and the feel of the track. I feel like a shorter one is going to be maybe give the track a little bit more kind of bounce later on once we add more elements. So I'm going to go for the shorter open hat. And I've got that sat at -16 there. These volumes are subject to change once more elements get thrown into the track. The next thing I'm going to do is add in a kind of shuffle, shakery loop that gives it some pace. I'm liking that one, that's pretty cool. So I'm going to turn that down a bit more. -19.6. And as you can hear, that gives the track pace and energy that it didn't have before. If I turn it off and add it in, I also feel like with a sound like that, it's definitely worth adding some panning in. For panning, I'm going to use Shaperbox 3, although there are loads of other tools out there which do exactly the same as this. And this is good because you can kind of very quickly and simply add in panning to make it kind of go left and right. So if I put it onto the curve there and then 1/4, you can now hear that going like that. It's a little bit like too much, so I'm going to just pull the dry wet mix down slightly. There you go, 2/3, so 66%. I'm now going to group these elements up that do all of the kind of high-end business, and I'm also going to put an EQ on. This is kind of really important because even though these sounds are for the high end, there may still be some kind of low-end information there which is unnecessary. So if I play this, and you can see here on the scope plugin whether there's any low-end information coming through that we don't need. So there is a little bit there. So if I just add this EQ on, that's much nicer, that's much cleaner. So next we're going to add in a clap. And with the claps, there again is some very key characteristics that kind of UK hardcore sound had in the 2000s as far as the claps go. And I'm going to show you and compare the two. So a more modern clap would sound like this here, or a less aggressive clap. But that classic kind of sound had more like a cht, cht kind of sound. So let's chuck that on. Let's get that into place and turn it down a little bit. It's got a slight reverb on that clap. I'm going to take the tail off of that. I think that's better. I may actually chuck this clap in as well just to see what it sounds like layered up. Yeah, I like that layered up. I'm going to group these up, and I'm going to put the glue compressor on those and some EQ. First up, the glue compressor. So you don't want loads of attack and it to sound too clicky. So if I put the attack down here, it sounds quite clicky. But if we bring the attack down a bit, I think that's a good middle ground there. Let's chuck an EQ on. And again, as with the percussion, very simply, I'm going to take out the low end. Although here, as you can see, there's not a great deal of low end information there. But I always just apply one anyway, just to be sure. Hear a little bit of a kind of like knocking sound there when I solo that. Okay, now I've got the sounds in, I'm going to just tweak the mix on some of these sounds, just see if I can get a little bit more out of them, starting with the EQ on the kick. Let's have a look at that. So I might add a touch more high end onto this kick. You can hear when I add that. It's kind of essentially adding what sounds like a closed hat on the kick. That there just gives the kick a little bit more attack. So at the moment I have a group for the kind of top end percussion and then a group for the clap. I'm going to just group those into a group and call that drums and percussion. And that now gives me the control to either turn down each individual sound, just the claps, or I can control all of the drums and percussion using this here. I certainly feel like that clap is a touch too loud and a bit in your face as it is, so I'm going to turn this down a little bit. So originally this classic sound had a tail on it, but I want to add just a really small reverb onto these claps, which I'm going to do using a plate reverb called Little Plate, something I really, really like. So if I solo this, don't want too much of a tail, I don't want any low end on this reverb. So I've turned that down by about 75%. So only 25% of the reverb is kind of coming through. I've also taken a lot of the low end out, and it's not got a very long decay either, just over 1 second. And that's just giving it a touch of reverb, which I kind of like. I'm going to go in and add a separate EQ onto the open hat and just make that a little brighter. If I turn that off and on, just bought like a little bit of the high end out of that as well, so I think that sounds pretty nice now. I'm going to turn all this down just a touch more. And finally, just to get a little bit more out of this percussion, I'm going to add in some saturation, and then after that I'm going to just add in another EQ because I want to make sure that I don't colour the low end of the percussion. So let's have a play around with the saturation first. I like the analog clip, but I'm going to flick through a few more just to see if there's any other alternatives. So I'm going to go for soft sine. It just brings out the high end a little more. I like that. Although I'm going to back off on the drive I added a second ago. The percussion just feels, all of the drums in fact, just feel a little bit more in your face with that saturation. And I'm going to just make sure there was no low end colouring added on that saturator by just adding another low cut at the end here. Some of these sounds can be turned up if you feel it necessary. For instance, I'm not a particularly big fan of very loud rides. I've got this sat here at minus 20.6. You might hear a ride kind of a few dB louder like this. Although personally, I like it just kind of sat in the background a little more like that. The key thing is when wanting to recreate that UK hardcore sound is to find some sounds that lean into that kind of 2000s era. So like I said earlier, there are some sounds that had like certain key characteristics, like the kicks had a very kind of thuddy mid-range, and a lot of the percussion we've used has got that kind of older, more rough sounding 909 feel to it, which certainly gives it like a kind of nostalgic feel. So they're really, really important. This rounds up the end of part one. The next one is going to be covering how to make that classic UK hardcore kind of distorted saw bass. I'm going to show you how to do it using Serum and then also using just a sample as well. Thank you very much for tuning in to the first episode. And if you liked what you've seen today, you can subscribe. And I've also left a link below to the sample pack I used today, which is called Out of the Box Hard Dance Samples by myself and Max Wolf. And it has, very importantly, a bonus UK happy hardcore section there, which is great for recreating this UK hardcore sound we've been going for today. Thank you very much for watching. I'll be back with episode 2 of this little mini series very soon.